Thanks, Brittany. Welcome, everybody. It's great to see so many people interested in this topic here early-ish on a Wednesday morning. So for those of you who may be kind of new to this work, the vision here is that we have a series of 4 webinars about non-credit to credit transitions. So today we're going to introduce to you the framework that we're using in Illinois to roll out non-credit to credit transitions. You've already been doing this work. Many of you have already been doing this work for 20 years. But there's been a definite focus on it in the last few years, and especially around some grant work that ICCB is doing. So this webinar is going to introduce the framework, and then in the subsequent webinars, we're going to get a little more into the weeds about how to implement various aspects of the framework. So without further ado, I thought it would be helpful to start by talking briefly about what the non-credit to credit transition kind of national picture looks like right now. And with that, there are like some very specific buckets we're going to look at. Once we do that, we're going to talk about the Illinois framework kind of high level and then get into the granular about each of the elements. And then I'm going to ask you to participate in a Microsoft Form survey to basically think about where you think your college is in the framework, which elements you feel like you've got handled, which are the elements that you haven't really developed yet. And then we'll wrap up with some resources and some next steps. So it's a pretty full agenda for our hour here today. So first, let's start by just talking a little about the non-credit to credit national picture. And when you look at that, there are these kind of 3 pieces that bubble to the surface. So the first one is that what the existing data shows is that there is not a lot of motion between non-credit and credit when it comes to students pursuing pathways. So some of the reasons this exists are things you're probably aware of, right? Like the way that we potentially build some silos, the ways we don't necessarily develop curriculum that stacks cleanly from non-credit to credit. But the biggest issue really with this first item is bullet number 2, which is that we don't really have a robust set of completion data around non-credit programs that we do with credit programs. So the reporting is a little bit different, and because of that, we don't necessarily have a good solid data set to know what this really looks like for students. So definitely data tracking becomes a larger issue, but we do also recognize that there is some need here for some better alignment. One of the other things that's coming out of the national data is that we know that non-credit programs as written have some really great positive outcomes for students, right? Like you do this work every day. This is probably not great news to many of you. And what we noticed for sure, these bullets kind of sub here. So when we look at non-credit programs and credentials versus folks who have no post-secondary education or training, we definitely see some earnings moving. We don't see it move as quickly as earners that have degrees, but we do notice that there is some variance there when we look at industries and states and then kind of cull the data by gender. So what the data that we do have can show that there are these positive associations with non-credit programming. And then, of course, like the third thing, which is really the big thing that's on the national scale right now, is looking at workforce Pell, which was signed into law this past July. It goes live July 1st of next year. And this is where programs that have 150 or more contact hours and 8 weeks or longer in duration will be eligible for federal funds. So that is a huge game changer. There are rules that are going to be written about this. The original schedule was supposed to be rule writing in December and January. I'm not sure how that is affected by the shutdown. That potentially could be pushed a little bit later. But that's something for you to definitely keep an eye on. Some of the curbs that we already know are going to be there are around demonstrating the value of non-credit programs and especially using student outcomes, not just outputs. So finding those pieces of data, like what are students who graduate from those programs earning as entry wages in those pathways, that's going to be something that we'll want to look at. There's definitely going to be more of an emphasis on completing various credentials, and then also looking at how those credentials allow students to continue on in their education, probably on the credit side. So this idea of non-credit to credit articulation then becomes kind of a centerpiece of what we look at for workforce Pell. So again, those are kind of the pieces to be aware of when we're thinking about kind of the national stage on this. And because of that, there's been a lot of work done about models for non-credit to credit transitions. So ultimately, this, for full disclosure, is one of my preferred models. So this was the model that ICCB agreed to kind of modify and adopt as the Illinois model. So this is the original model from Education Strategy Group. They worked over a period of a few years with about 14 colleges that were trying to figure out how to do better work around non-credit to credit transition. So this to say, you're not alone in your quest. This has been a hot topic for quite a while now. One of the factors that really kind of inspired this was this idea about reducing the amount of duplicated curriculum that students experience. So they organized this framework first around these core principles, that all the work needed to be student-centric, that it needed to be informed by labor market data, and that innovation needed to be a key feature. So we wanted to see something, you know, that was different than what we'd seen in the past. So from that bucket of core principles, then this kind of framework came out of that. So it was this piece around seeing all students as students. I think sometimes when we talk about this bifurcation between credit and non-credit, one of the issues that usually comes up is students on the credit side have a more robust wraparound experience than students on the non-credit side. So a integral part of this framework then is that all students are seen as students and all students can get those services. Also that these institutions built non-credit to credit pathways, so students could get on the pathway in a non-credit program and matriculate over to the credit side. In order to make that work, there was a lot of governance aligning that needed to happen. So again, sometimes we think about silos of credit programming and non-credit programming. So these colleges were really trying to figure out how to put credit and non-credit under a single umbrella. And again, kind of doing a little bit of work about credit worthiness of non-credit, especially certificates, and figuring out how to really leverage those as students are moving along the pathway, which again kind of becomes this removing the barriers to transition. So that was their framework. And then to implement it, these were the steps folks needed to go through. So kind of claiming a starting point, establishing a vision, identifying stakeholders, dealing with the culture of the institution, using data to inform their decisions, which I think is something we talk a lot about. But again, knowing that the data collection in non-credit is a little bit different than on the credit side, there was a bit of work around that. And then again, aligning curriculum, especially to build the best pathway for students, and then communicating all of that out to all of the stakeholders involved. So that is the ESG model. And from that, here is your Illinois model. So again, taking some of the pieces from ESG and then modifying some other pieces. So we'll get into the weeds in a minute, but the high level view here is choosing a starting point is the first step, this kind of purple bucket over here on the left. We have 4 options that tend to be the kinds of projects colleges engage in when they're first starting to do this kind of transitional work. So you only need to pick one. If your institution wants to do all 4, I will not stop you, but the expectation is you'll pick one as kind of the starting point strategy. Once you've identified that strategy, then you're going to lay the groundwork. This middle bucket in blue, for this, you'll do all of the bullets listed on here. And then once that project is basically launched, then you'll move to the green bucket, which is managing the change so that it actually persists. So that is kind of the 3 buckets that we're going to look at today. So I'm going to take you through each of the buckets and the bullets, and then give you some examples that come largely from the work you've already done. So for the sake of full disclosure, ICCB did share some information with me that you had reported about your projects. So I was able to look at the kinds of things you've done and then use your work as examples in each of these. But I won't disclose the institution since I did not tell you I was going to do that. So this first step is pick a starting point, right? So think about which of these 4 ideas seems to resonate the best with your institution. None of these are better than any others. And I really think having this kind of variety is more kind of a nod to the fact that how one institution thinks about this is not going to be the same as every other institution. So as an example, let's look at the first one. So removing structural divides, these are the kinds of things you'd be looking at. Ways to unite non-credit and credit departments, right? This idea I just mentioned about like kind of siloing non-credit business courses from credit business courses. Instead, you might remove that structural divide and say all business courses now live under this umbrella, credit or non-credit, right? And that a key feature of this idea also is that there's really more coordination and communication about those moving parts. So it isn't so much these 2 different silos, but really thinking about how these kinds of policies, procedures, systems, job descriptions really become kind of common across the entities. So as an example, from the work you submitted, you had this, one of you had this as kind of an insight about the work. So you can see here they updated their credit for prior learning policy and procedure that could help with this kind of articulation. So here, this example where you see a structural divide and you're addressing a policy or procedure to kind of remove that divide and make that flow a little better. So structural divides is definitely one of our starting point strategies. A second one, and I feel like in Illinois, this is probably the most popular of the starting points, is developing bridge tools that allow you to award credit. So in this scenario, the structural divide likely remains intact, and instead you're developing a bridge to move kind of from silo to silo, right? So thinking about if you can find a way to articulate a non-credit course to a credit course, or maybe looking at stackable credentials where the very first credential happens on the non-credit side, and then students matriculate to the credit side to move to the next stackable credential. Or as we looked at in the prior example, this idea of credit for prior learning as the way to kind of bridge the divide. So here was an example from one of the colleges that I thought was kind of interesting. In this example, the course is co-seated, so it's a single section of a course, and then in that course, some of the students are registered as a credit student for that course, and some are registered as a non-credit course. And then assuming that the student completes the course successfully, they're able to then use credit for prior learning to be transcripted for that course. So that's a bridging tool to award credit in that case. These next 2 pieces, I feel like look at the issue a little bit differently, which is kind of like in the development of the program itself, there's something kind of different going on. Versus I feel like the first two pieces around bridging tools and removing the structural divide, to me, are kind of looking at a similar kind of piece of this puzzle. These next two pieces about making industry focused programs credit based and then orienting non-credit training for demand driven pathways really look more at the program itself and look at how to kind of make those pieces credit eligible kind of from jump, right? So in this idea, we're going to look at things like accreditation. And many times on the credit side, programs are accredited. Once something is accredited, it tends to have a certain amount of kind of reputation built into it that seems to be more easily accepted for credit. So the idea here is like one of the ways to make a non-credit program have a better argument for credit is looking into likely accreditors for those programs and getting that program to be accredited. That is definitely an investment in time and resources. So some of these other pieces may make more sense for you. So if accrediting a program is not really in the cards for you, you may be able to do this same industry focused programs credit-based idea by aligning your objectives in the non-credit coursework to those courses on the credit side. And then again, thinking about kind of reverse engineering, backward designing those courses so that the courses on the non-credit basically become stackable courses into that credit pathway. So you're designing these courses from the beginning to lead into that credit. So this was an example from one of the colleges where they're taking a community health worker program that was non-credit and they're transitioning it to credit. So this idea of kind of taking this and making it become credit-based. And then the flip side, or like the companion to this, is orienting non-credit training for demand-driven pathways. So making sure that whatever we are developing aligns to emerging industry demands. In this version, the silos can kind of remain intact, but you're still building that pathway using labor market data, employer driven wishes, basically, and thinking about what are the skills that students need in order to be immediately employable. This, I think, is very common in the work that you're already doing. So just kind of then figuring out like, what is the way that we can argue this is a demand-driven pathway, and how do we then connect that to something happening on the credit side, or how can we have this then become a credit program? So, and you can see here in this example, this institution is using Lightcast data, which I'm assuming most of you use Lightcast or something similar, right? So using a data firm's product to figure out what is the labor market telling you in terms of where the demands are, what the skill sets are for technical skills, for soft skills, right? What employers are asking for. So this is going to be a little bit participatory. So when you think about these four starting points, so removing the structural divides, developing bridge tools, making industry-focused programs credit-based, or orienting non-credit training towards demand-driven pathways, which of these seems to be the most likely starting point for your institution? And for this activity, I'll give you, if this doesn't sound like a lot of time, I'll give you 15 seconds to think about it. And then put a number into the chat that you think is going to be the most likely starting point for your institution. And you can see the variety, right? I think this was something, yeah, that was clear kind of in the reports that you were giving to ICCB too, that there is no single way to get this done in Illinois, and that when we look across the state, we have examples of all four strategies happening, which I actually think is great news for many reasons. But one of the primary reasons being for some of you out there who haven't selected a starting point yet, you have colleagues out there who are doing all these versions of this idea. So if there are colleges on the call today who are thinking we need to figure out which one is the right fit, you have resources in each other too about how these pieces kind of work and what made them pick the thing that they're picking, right? For those of you who picked, who shared in the chat that you picked a particular thing, are you comfortable talking a little bit about why you picked the one that you picked for your institution? If so, you can put it in the chat or you can come off mute.
Hi, I'm Kristen from Illinois Central College and in Peoria. And I don't know if CHW comes from us or if anybody else is doing it, but we've had CHW for a while. We updated it to meet the Illinois Department of Public Health requirements. And I would say we did the Make Industry Focused programs credit-based. I would say that now we're going back and we have to remove some structural divides. So that's it. I think that that's a really good starting point is structural divides and not that it's not possible to do number 3 before number 1, but it definitely um, it it would have helped, I think.
Yeah, Kristen, thank you for being brave to share. and I think you're absolutely right. One of the things, so remember, in this bucket, you only need to pick one as the thing you want to do. In the next bucket, we get a little bit more into engaging stakeholders and addressing institutional culture, which I feel like those pieces totally point back to the structural divide issue, right? That again, because like we really kind of built our organizations as very siloed entities. So now trying to figure out how to get the silos to talk to each other. I don't even know that like you can really disrupt it to the point that the silo is gone. But I do think, or maybe removing silos inside the silos. I feel like it's a very kind of onion metaphor. But yeah, absolutely. Like there are these engagement of stakeholder pieces and kind of cultural norm pieces that need to be discussed and potentially altered to make the work better, for sure. And then Joel, I see your comment in the chat that you had a year-long team effort to look at this, and then number 2 was what they identified. Yeah. So for you, you kind of did the piece, like the lay the groundwork piece, and then do the selection, which is also fine. And I think that's something too with our model is you may find you flow a little bit back and forth between our 3 buckets, and that's fine. And then Dr. Benani, am I saying your name right? You have your hand raised?
Yes. Yes, who have already implemented the Noncredit to credit. I'm just curious how your college is implementing. Was it difficult, and what has been the process for the Pell Grant? Because we know since the last 2 years, Pell Grant could be used for the non-credit. Thank you.
Are you asking me for Pell Grant? There's a workforce version of Pell that was approved in July that goes live next July that will be for short-term non-credit certificates. So that's that piece where if it's 150 hours instead of what's the original 600 hours, I think. So I'm not, and again, financial aid is definitely not my background. So I don't want to speak incorrectly about that. But the workforce Pell, the piece that I'm aware of is that it will be for shorter term credentials that are much fewer hours and then shorter in duration. But that doesn't go live till July of 26.
Is there any college from those attending using Pell Grant in the non-credit side, please?
So colleagues, are any of you using Pell for non-credit currently?
I don't think they can. Pell, this is Lavon. I'm sorry.
Hey, Lavon.
So, but Patty, I do need to jump in and answer a question that came up in chat because I want to clarify something. Is that okay?
Yeah.
It just came up in your, okay. So it says, when are non-credit to credit activities when will they become required? And what is the deadline? At this point, it's not a required, it is not a deliverable, and there is not a deadline. The point is that everyone was asked to at least identify some aspect of non-credit to credit that you wanted to work on. And so, the point is that this would help you with whatever, as Patty said, whatever point you're at to help you move forward. As in the past, we've given you an option in the quarterly reports to indicate what you're doing on non-credit to credit. But at this point, it is not required. I mean, it's required to be doing something. I'm sorry, I didn't mean that. But they're not, the activities are not, it's required to be working on something, but it's not a deliverable in the sense of like your measures are. Like how many students are you serving? How many employers are you going to? How many non-employer? That sort of thing. It's this year, we're offering this to help you with your non-credit to credit, and then we would see what that looks like. We will probably ask you at the end, like, what did you get to, that sort of thing, but it's not a deliverable, and there is not at this point any deadline for implementation. Officially. So I don't want anybody to think this was not included in the notice of funding opportunity for any of those things, but it is something that you are, required to at least begin working on or work on. And then, this is to help you chart your progress, if I understand Patty correctly. So to help you work through your progress from whatever point you're at. And you all identified those. Most of you identified the non-credit to credit strategy that you're working on. It may be continue from last year. These could go on. A lot of these things could take a long time. It could be a new one that you're adding, like the community health worker, that sort of thing. And that'll take a time. First, you got to do the non-credit, and then you got to get it moved to credit. So, so relax on that. This is to help you move forward, get started, and we'll look at what everything looks like when we finish with when Patty finishes her work. Does that help? Hello?
Yeah, it helped me, Lavon.
Okay. Like I said, it's not a deliverable, but it is a required element. And everyone, except for a few, and if you're at the none stage, a really good place to start would be with her point about the college that took time as a team to evaluate what they needed to do to have a project, to come up with something to move non-credit to credit. So something in there. So that may be where you even start if you at this point have not identified. And there were very few of those, by the way, and we will be following up with them. So, but we wanted to let you know that. And I saw Whitney responded to my earlier comment, correct. Non-credit is not eligible for Pell. So
Great,
yep.
Thank you.
So thank you for allowing me to take that time, Patty.
Yeah, no, thanks, Lavon. Thanks for clarifying. And Whitney, thanks for the bit about non-credit not being eligible for Pell at present.
Right.
Okay, so The next step is to lay the groundwork. So this, again, kind of as we've talked about, does harken back a bit to this idea around removing barriers, the way that you'll be laying the groundwork. And for this, you'll want to hit all of these buckets inside this step. So you'll want to do all of these pieces: engage stakeholders, address institutional culture, collect and analyze data, align your internal operations, identify that initial pathway, and then go ahead and build it. So again, when we talk about engaging stakeholders, you want to cast a relatively wide net at some point. Now, this doesn't mean that in the beginning, this may not start out as kind of a small group. In some of the work that I've done, I think you often realize as you start to have these kind of stakeholder meetings, issues arise and you think, oh, we need to add somebody from financial aid, or we need somebody from marketing, right? Like, so your team of stakeholders may flex a little bit as you kind of move through the work. And that's fine. You probably do want to figure out, like, what's a core team that will be kind of the leaders of this particular effort. And they'll be the people who really kind of articulate the vision, figure out how pieces get implemented, what you're going to look at in terms of, again, not just outputs, but outcomes of this particular project. And then really with stakeholders, the pieces that are most critical are around regularly communicating, even if it's just like, here's where we're at with the project, here's what we hope to be doing next, and here's by when, and building trust between the partners. Because again, in the silos, you don't necessarily share trust between the silos. So this was an answer from one of the colleges, what that I thought had a really good vibe just about how their cross-departmental team was working, how the meetings were happening, that they were even including academic departments, financial aid, records, advising, like all of these kinds of stakeholders who would eventually need to weigh in on some piece of the process. And then closely related to that is this idea of institutional culture. So as we kind of talked about earlier, this idea of realignment of the organizational culture to make way for non-credit to credit transitions can take sustained effort, let's just say that, and also sustained investment. So thinking about the investment we're asking for in terms of people time, but also in terms of resources, are you going to need to think differently about what kinds of technology you use to kind of approve things like credit for prior learning, if that's how you're doing it? Or are you going to need to allow for more faculty time to assess portfolios if you're doing portfolios in prior learning assessment, right? So like thinking about how we allocate funds as part of our institutional culture and how we allocate human resources also, I think, are both kind of the pieces. And I can see Kristen is in the chat talking about making sure folks understand why you're asking them to participate in this process. I think is definitely, you're going to get, I think you're going to get better effort from folks when they understand what their role is. And again, lack of clarity is not going to be your friend here, right? But for institutional culture to change, I do see this idea of like stakeholder involvement and culture kind of holding hands in my mind, right? That like these pieces work together, and then through fostering those relationships and sharing the mission and the vision for this project, then you can really start to see some positive changes happen to promote these kinds of projects. So this I thought was a good example, a share up from one of the colleges about building relationships and trying to foster collaboration between faculty on the credit and non-credit sides of the house. And then data, I feel like, is always something that we know we need to be doing better or differently, but it often is another silo. So thinking about, where does the data live at your institution? how is the data that you keep maybe a little bit separate from what the institution keeps as their official data, if that's a thing at your institution. Thinking also about what we do with that internal data, how we disaggregate it, how it helps us identify patterns and trends among students and programs, looking at your external data, figuring out, again, like what your Lightcast, what your labor market information is telling you. This share out from one of the colleges I thought was a really interesting idea about data analysis. So thinking about comparing data between grant funded and non-grant funded students in the same programs and looking for kinds of patterns there, I thought was a great idea in terms of how you could use data to then inform practice, especially around this idea of transition. And then ideally, once you've done all of these other pieces, right? Like, so we've done work with stakeholders, we've done work around culture, we've looked at the data. Now we can really argue for operational alignment. So figuring out what is the right infrastructure you need to actually support this transition. Back to the ESG model, the original model, one of the things they really looked at, again, around this idea of wraparound services was kind of trying to figure out, like, if we are providing wraparound services to all students, credit and non-credit, what does that do to the workload of the humans providing those services? So thinking about infrastructure in those kinds of, like in workload and workflow kind of ways, I think is really helpful. And again, this idea of aligning departments and governance so that everybody is pretty clear on who the deciders are and how decision flows work at your institution. And related to that, doing an audit. I should probably not use audit as a word, but a review of policies and procedures to figure out, do you have policies and procedures that contribute to these barriers when we're trying to move students from non-credit to credit? So again, here this share out I thought was kind of a really great nod to thinking about how to look at structure and how structure either allows for or impedes non-credit to credit transition. And then once you've done all of that, hopefully what happens is some initial pathway ideas kind of start bubbling up to the surface. And you can think about in-demand pathways in terms of what students are interested in pursuing, right? So when you're realizing like, hey, we offered this item and it always sells out, that's great. You know, you have the student demand there. You can also look at in-demand pathways in terms of, and I think you should, industry demand, because again, this is really kind of where the workforce Pell is going to ask us to demonstrate that the demand by industry is part of this. So, and I think you'll also find too, there are some certificates where you're thinking like, hey, this could be an obvious alignment. Like here's kind of an introduction to IT, and then that could be an on-ramp to this certificate on the credit side too. And then as the example, so this share out from a college was basically looking at CompTIA offerings and how those could then transition over into the information technology degree at their institution. And then once you actually have things figured out in terms of where's the direction you're going to go, then you build the pathway that ideally is a clear path between non-credit and credit. And I feel like a lot of that boils down to how you structure it, but also how you communicate that. So these were two different share outs from schools that I thought did a nice job thinking about like what looks like a clear pathway. So this first one in an industrial program, thinking about certified production tech and how these classes equal this particular certificate, which is a certificate within a credit-bearing program. So being able to kind of easily explain to students, you take this, this equals this, and then that puts you on this pathway. So I thought that was really great. And then this other example from the vinyl wrap curriculum. And then again, this idea about demonstrating mastery. So kind of leaning more into competency-based education for this idea. And then aligning those competencies directly with course outcomes, then places the student in a certain place in that stream of that credit curriculum. So I thought those were both kind of really great examples of how to think about that. Okay, so here again, waterfall this. When you think about these pieces for laying the groundwork, is there a piece here where you think it's going to be a larger challenge than maybe one of the other pieces? So for this waterfall, we're going to identify which of these seems to be kind of the most likely challenge for your institution. Oh, right off the bat, data. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, and for those of you picking data for what it's worth, I mean, that's kind of what the national information is telling us too, is that the data is the thing that's kind of tricky. And then for those of you picking align internal operations, yes, I think part of what's tricky about that, and maybe it is connected, I see some of you picking aligning internal operations and connecting that with industry or institutional culture. I totally hear you there. I think that is part of what's tricky, was that we built credit and non-credit as at most institutions as kind of separate entities. And now we're asking you to please find a way to merge those things. So I do think it is a bit institutional culture in that we created this bifurcation. And then when we're asking to align those operations, it gets tricky because we're asking you to kind of fight the culture to get this mission accomplished, right? Yeah. Is anyone willing to share their experience, either coming off mic or putting it into the chat?
It was Eric Kurtz. I would just say I'm amazed in the college setting, or maybe in any setting, that when we look at a need for a program that addresses skill needs, that we don't in the colleges consider all the possible routes to solving that problem. Even when we audit, I sat in on some audits of different programs in the last couple of years on the credit side, and they're not even thinking about the non-credit side. So it's fascinating to me, which is why, one of the things I put down was the cultural shift is gigantic. But if you think it from the business aspect, if you're developing a product or a service, think about all the different markets you might serve with that and what the different pathways are into that, into purchasing that. But I know that's a different way of thinking for academia, but I feel like we leave a lot of money on the table and we leave a lot of people unserved because we're super narrow in how we look at this. So that's kind of my 2 pennies worth.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. I don't disagree. I think institutional culture is a bear in this particular topic for sure. And it's funny because I was talking to an employer a few weeks ago and I was inquiring about credit versus non-credit. And he was basically like, well, why do you want me to cull this into buckets like that? Like he was very much like, these are the skills I need. I'm not really married to credit or non-credit. I need to know, to your point, Eric, right? That like skills are the thing that we're getting at.
Patty, if I just add that, I also feel like we're in a bit of competition for misaligned priorities. So there's a priority from the credit side because there's money that comes back to the college based on credit programs that are offered and delivered. And, we're not in that same boat unless we're offering 1.6s. So I feel like which in the my non-credit space, for the contract training, we don't do any 1.6s, but there's another goal or objective being served, right?
Yeah.
That I think is getting in the way of really what's best for the audience.
Yeah. Thank you, Eric.
It's probably not a popular view to be shared, so I'm sorry that I'm on
No,
recording
well,
for that.
no. And I think maybe Brittany will edit that part out. But I think you point to something, which is the funding of all of these activities, right? Like if we want to figure out how to really institutionalize this idea of non-credit and credit transition, how we pay for it is definitely going to be part of that conversation. So I don't think you're wrong to talk about that. I do want to briefly cover the final step in the Illinois model, which is managing change. So this is the piece where you articulate the vision, right? Like, and again, you may find that you do pieces of step 3 while you're still doing step 2, right? So you may be needing to articulate the vision while you're still kind of building. It's a little bit build the bike, ride the bike, but we're okay. Like you can flow back and forth between steps as you need to make the pieces work for you. Also, with step 2, in step 3, you'll want to make sure that you're doing all of these things. And I'm going to show you in a minute why it's best to make sure you hit all of these branches in the tree. So articulating the vision, supporting the implementation with things like professional development, but then also with exemplars, like creating guides, templates, sample pathways so that folks can see how to do it. And then again, we're going to revisit the data. And that's really part of kind of this last bullet that we think about continuous improvement and ways to kind of refine the process. So I'm not sure if all of you are familiar with this particular model for successful change management, but when I was thinking about what all is in the bucket for managing change, I was thinking about this model. So I feel like this very closely kind of mimics what we expect you to do in terms of managing the change. So the first one is that you need to tell what is going on, right? So you see like this first column is the tell, what is your strategy? Why are you doing what you're doing? These next 3 columns are all about training and professional development. So building consensus, providing skills, and then providing incentives. So that to me is very much the support, implementation, professional development, creating guides and templates and samples. The next column is providing the hardware and the resources, which to me is kind of the collecting and analyzing data. And then embedding is refining the process and making it really institutionalized. So I feel like these columns kind of mimic what we're asking you to do in Noster's model for change. And you can see here, if you hit every bucket, then you will be able to successfully implement change, right? Like those all orange bars across the top equal change. If you start to knock out any particular piece in the matrix, then you're going to end up with something less than change. So if you don't articulate the vision clearly, like in that second row, the telling of the strategy is orange, redded out, I guess. When you're not clear about the vision, you don't get change, you get confusion, right? Or if you don't, then through like training and professional development, help develop consensus, you end up with sabotage instead of commitment. So you can kind of see how by missing out on these various pieces and parts, your change management project goes a little less well than perhaps it could. But several of you are already working on change management at your institutions, and these were some of the examples submitted from yourselves. So this first one I thought was really kind of interesting because I feel like it shows like how this change is really being supported in the leadership, in mapping the steps, in coming to like a formalized version of the process, to involving faculty, right? Like that really managing the change is about institutionalizing this transitional piece of curriculum. The middle one I thought was interesting because, again, it kind of nods to this idea of continuous improvement and how this course kind of flexes non-credit to credit, looking at student interest and student voice. And then finally, the last one here again, kind of this nod to thinking about marketing and making sure that as part of how we communicate the vision, we're updating sell sheets and websites, and that that's all part of how we manage the change. Now, for the sake of time, I'm not going to have you do this final waterfall activity. Instead, we're going to go straight to this. So I've created a Microsoft form that I would like for you to complete right now. So Dalton is going to drop a link into the chat for you to access the Microsoft form, or if you have a mobile device, you can scan this QR code and it will take you to the form. So assess where you are in the where your college is, basically, in the framework. I'll give you a few minutes to do that. I'll be quiet. Survey. So let's chat a little bit about next steps. So maybe I probably should have said this before I had to do the form. So I'm going to take the information that you're putting into the forms and then figure out from there what kind of technical assistance and support to offer your institution. So I will be taking the survey data, and then I'll be reaching out to you to offer some assistance as you're implementing your programs. I'm also working on developing a list of online resources to share with you all about some of those projects I talked about earlier in terms of what's going on at the national level, and then some other resources that might help you implement these projects at your institutions. And then related to that, we're creating a handbook that will be about non-credit to credit transitions, and specifically the Illinois model and what each of those buckets is all about. So look for those. And then this is the first of the 4 webinar series. So the next webinar will be in December. And we're going to talk about really getting onto the framework and using this idea of collaboration and stakeholders and how you can kind of navigate some of the complexities, things including union agreements, and where sometimes those have certain language in it that precludes certain activities on the non-credit side. So we'll talk about that in December. And then in January, we'll talk about this idea of kind of backward designing and content mapping, and looking at that as one of the kind of non-credit to credit strategies. And then also kind of how industry credentials kind of figure into that content mapping. So we'll do that in January. And then in April, as the final session, we'll really talk about how do you scale this and how do you institutionalize that. And really, that'll be more around the organizational culture, governance, alignment of departments, and that kind of thing. So those are the webinars. And then here are the resources that were featured in today's session. So the model from ESG, there's also a model that Jobs for the Future has been working on with the Lumina Foundation that I thought was really great. Rutgers has a division out there, the Education and Employment Research Center, and they also did a study about non-credit programs and their outcomes, and I thought that was worth taking a look. And then this last piece on Workforce Pell is an article that Whitney shared with me that I thought was really helpful in thinking about what the ramifications are for this new kind of funding stream. So these resources, I'll have live links here. And then just, I know we only have about a minute left, but what questions do you have for me that we didn't get to already in our show today?